Thanks so much for joining us here on Weather Nation. I'm meteorologist Carissa Kloss with a closer look at the incredible flooding threat that's already taking place across the north central U.S. Now we want to dive in not only into what's happening right now, but talk about how this is going to impact the rest of the water basins farther downstream, not only in the short term, but as we take a look at a spring that could be very soggy across parts of the United States. Joining me now is Ed Clark. He's the director of NOAA's National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Ed, thank you so much for your time. First off, I want to talk to you about the fact that 2/3 of the lower 48 are expecting some kind of flooding risk through May. That is huge, especially considering what's already happening out there right now.
Well, that's correct. So not only are 2/3 of the lower 48 states under the gun for an elevated risk of flooding this spring, but over 200 million citizens in this country have some elevated risk of flooding in their communities. In fact, 43 million have a potential to see moderate flooding where roads and structures may be inundated, and 13 million Americans have the potential, as we have documented in our spring flood outlook, to see major flooding in and around their communities.
And the fact that it's already happening right now, is it going to be the same locations that are experiencing flooding? Will it be farther downstream? How do we geographically encapsulate that risk?
So our colleagues at the 13 river forecast centers and the 122 weather forecast offices collaborate with us throughout the spring, late winter, spring months to produce a spring flood outlook. And so our folks up in the north central river forecast center, as well as the Missouri River Basin, are really assessing the threat that we have now on the ground due to much above average soil moisture, continued frozen ground, as well as a pretty deep snowpack that we've built throughout the winter. So where the flooding has occurred over the Missouri River Basin, we certainly expect some portions, the middle to lower Missouri, the Vermilion, the Big Sioux in South Dakota, that could see another peak occur in the next couple of weeks. There's also potential in the Red River of the North, as well as the headwaters of the Mississippi, for a new round of flooding, increased crests. Now, the magnitude of that flooding will be directly related to the weather that we experience in the spring. So if we have a rapid rise in temperature and very efficient snowmelt processes, and even, God forbid, a rain on snow event, well, then we're going to have a more exacerbated flooding event. If the weather behaves, we hang onto that snowpack, melt it off efficiently, then there's potential to reduce that threat. But make no mistake, the Red River of the North, portions of the middle Missouri, portions of the upper Mississippi, they are certainly potentially seeing the threat for an elevated risk of major flooding this year in 2019.
Is there anything you can give us to compare with this? Because a lot of folks in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Iowa, Minnesota are kind of thinking back to the last time this happened in 2011. Looking at the forecast through the spring, is there anything that, or a year in the past, an event in the past that you can compare it to give us some perspective?
Well, we have certainly done that. We've looked at 2011 and 2009, which are two relatively big years of flooding on the Mississippi as well as in the Red River of the North. Right now, we see snowpack across the Red River of the North and in portions of Minnesota that is 6 to 8 inches, 4 to 6 inches with isolated pockets of 8 inches. That's higher than it was in 2009, but again, how that snow melts will really be the driving factor of whether or not we see major and widespread major flooding. Looking downstream in the communities along the main stem Mississippi, it's really important to remember that main stem Mississippi flooding from 2011, when in early May the Army Corps of Engineers operated the New Madrid floodway by removing the Birds Point levee system. That was really a rainfall event that was driven by much above average, 400 to 600% of May precipitation that occurred over the Ohio River Valley. So unless we see a pretty big widespread liquid event, we don't anticipate that the main stem Mississippi will see the levels that they reached in 2011. But again, the system is primed. Our offices are monitoring the signal. They're monitoring the weather, obviously, and we're keeping an eye on this, and we'll continue to do so until we get out of this 2019 flood threat.
And part of today's outlook also included temperature and precipitation compared to average forecast as we start to head throughout the next few months. Can you speak on what we expect as far as potential for precipitation between April, May, and June?
So absolutely. So our Climate Prediction Center, located up there in College Park, Maryland, is expecting an above-average potential for precipitation, really in the the eastern two-thirds of the country. So that same area that's under the threat for minor, moderate, and major flooding could see elevated potential for precipitation this year. In addition to that, the temperature outlook for much of the Northwest is for above average temperatures, including Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and potentially even below average temperatures there for the middle tier of the country. And that will allow us to hold on the snowpack longer and longer into the season. And again, that elevates the risk for either a rain on snow event or a very rapid warming. So our colleagues at CPC, our colleagues at the weather forecast offices really will need to continue to pay attention and work throughout their stakeholder network to monitor and assess the situation and warn the public.
And one more quick question for you. With the above average snowpack and the elimination of drought in California, do you have any concerns there going into the spring?
Well, anytime in the western U.S. when you have streams running high with snowmelt and you have the potential for a springtime rain event, there can be isolated minor flooding. There is a potential across the Sierra Nevada, portions of Nevada, where we're seeing an elevated risk for minor flooding, a moderate, an isolated, extremely isolated pocket in the Snake River Plain for moderate flooding in and around the Boise River system, the Big Wood River. But those are minor in comparison potentially to what's looming upstream, both in the middle Missouri and the main stem Mississippi.
I'm sure that is very good for them to hear after such a rough winter out west. A huge thank you to Ed Clark, the director of NOAA's National Water Center in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, as they issue their spring flood outlook. I know that many people in the heart of the country are going to be watching this very closely over the next few months. We'll have a bit more on that flooding forecast coming up in just a bit. Stay with us.